A while back in one of my videos, I made a comment about the quality of a steak. I said, I'm not gonna sit here and say that you could serve this thing at an Outback Steakhouse. I think that would be offensive to my Australian viewers. And people were not happy about it.
I'm Australian and we don't have Outback Steakhouse.
in Australia.
We don't have Outback Steakhouse in Australia.
Just to set the record straight, I was and am fully aware that Outback Steakhouse is a Tampa-based chain. It just happens to be one of my favorite jokes to pretend that my entire knowledge of Australia is derived from the assumption that Outback is a completely authentic representation of Australian culture. Steak at every meal, Land Rovers just ripping through the desert, people eating bloomin' onions left and right. But those comments did get me thinking. I bet there are some Outback locations in Australia, and as it turns out, there are 8. So I thought to myself, what if I flew to Australia to eat at an Australian Outback Steakhouse? I mean, what would it even be like? Would it be more authentic? Would it be popular? Only one way to find out. Something you may not know about Australia is that it is not close. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's to always commit to the bit. All you have to do is drive 3 hours to the nearest major airport, sit on the runway for 3 more hours, miss your connecting flight from Vancouver to Sydney even though the plane is sitting right there and hasn't left yet, get rerouted on another flight to Brisbane. You know what? I'll skip ahead. After what seemed like forever, I had made it. I knew that it was going to be late summer in Australia when I bought the tickets, but the heat and humidity smacked me in the face. For context, it was in the 30s when I left Vancouver, and it was in the 80s with 90% humidity when I landed in Brisbane. I bought a SIM card, picked up my rental car, and set out for the nearest Outback Steakhouse. I had a little bit of time to kill because it was 10 a.m. local time and Outback didn't open until noon, which was actually perfect because it gave me some time to get used to driving. I found out like a week before that you drive on the left side of the road in Australia. You can definitely chalk this up to my own ignorance, but I thought that was just the UK that did that. Oh, a roundabout? First thing I have to do is a roundabout? Come on. The blinker's also on the wrong side. I keep turning the windshield wipers on because that's where the blinker's supposed to be. Basically, it was like playing Mario Kart on mirror mode. I don't know if this is a cop behind me. What do cops even look like here? I don't know. I stopped and got some coffee because technically my body still thought it was 7:30 p.m. the night before. And then after a terrifying 15-minute drive filled with constantly reminding myself to stay on the left side of the road. Left side of the road. Left side of the road. I finally saw it. Here it is. The Outback Steakhouse. It was just like I always imagined it would be, a beacon of Australian culture. It is packed. I'm happy to see that Outback is alive and well in Australia. This location appeared to be in the middle of some sort of home-themed shopping plaza, like it was surrounded by furniture and rug stores. I was so giddy walking up to the entrance. I went inside and asked for a table for one, and I was thrilled to hear the hostess respond in an Australian accent. So in terms of authenticity, this place was already a 10 out of 10. My server, on the other hand, did not have an Australian accent, but you can't win them all. Even though the parking lot was full, the restaurant itself wasn't particularly crowded. There were maybe 2 or 3 other tables occupied when I arrived, so maybe those cars were there for the furniture stores. But to be fair, Outback had just opened. Interestingly, out of the 8 Outback locations in Australia, 6 of them are in New South Wales, which is more than they have in 19 of the 50 US states. So I don't know, I mean, it seems decently successful. I ordered a Coke and started browsing the menu. The bread came out almost immediately, and I was shocked to find out that it was not the same iconic brown bread that they serve at American Outback locations. For my meal, I eventually decided on a bloomin' onion to start, because when in Rome, and then I had to get steak. I was a little thrown off by the measurement being in grams instead of ounces. I ordered the 285 gram ribeye, not really knowing how big that would be. And then for my 2 sides, I got a Caesar salad and mashed potatoes. I was also feeling a little crazy, so I put in an order for a milkshake for dessert. No milkshakes on the current American menu. The spacing of the text was a little confusing, so I wasn't sure if I was getting a chocolate thunder strawberry cheesecake milkshake or just a chocolate thunder milkshake. But I like to live on the edge, so I did not ask for clarification. As I was waiting for my food, I started looking around and really taking in my surroundings, and all of a sudden I had a shocking realization. And I'll tell you what that was in just a minute, but first I'd love to tell you about BetterHelp, who's the sponsor of this episode. The fact that I'm even able to do stuff like this is seriously a dream come true, but a couple years ago I was in a much different place mentally. And eventually I decided to start seeing a therapist to help process some of the emotions I was experiencing. It can be really tough to take the first step towards getting help, and I think my pride got in the way. But therapy was really, really helpful, and I ended up making some changes in my life that have helped lead me to where I am today.
Not like geographically in Australia, but just in terms of my mental health.
And that's why I'm really grateful to partner with BetterHelp. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who's trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice.
If you've watched the channel before, you know that I end every episode by saying it's going to be okay. And talking to a therapist can be a huge step in the right direction towards things feeling okay. A mentor of mine when I was in college would always say, I think everybody could benefit from seeing a therapist, and that really helped destigmatize therapy for me.
And BetterHelp makes it easy because you can choose from a phone call, video chat, or messaging, however you feel most comfortable.
I also appreciate that I got to answer questions to help match me with the right therapist on BetterHelp, like what type of topics you might want to discuss, and even your faith background if that's important to you.
They also have a 4.5-star rating on Trustpilot. So if you want to try BetterHelp, go to betterhelp.com/SamReed or click the link below, and BetterHelp will match you to an experienced professional therapist.
Make sure to use that link or choose Sam Reed during sign up to get a discount on your first month.
And thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this episode. Okay, back to this epiphany I had while sitting at an Outback Steakhouse in Brisbane, Australia. I can't believe I hadn't noticed it right away, but as I looked around, I realized that this place was straight up not Australia themed. For comparison, I went to an Outback in Virginia the week before, and there were Australian flags, pictures of Australian landmarks, boomerangs, signs that say stuff like the Aussie way, but there wasn't any of that here. Instead, it seemed like the theme was just cows. All the decor was focused on the steakhouse part and not the Outback part. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I know I've been joking about Outback being Australian, but in the US, that's like their whole thing. Without the Australia theme, they're just like a restaurant that sells steak, like a Texas Roadhouse or a Longhorn Steakhouse. To be fair, it is kind of a head scratcher as to why Outback is Australia themed in the first place. It was founded by 4 Americans who, as far as I know, have no direct connection to Australia. And this Reddit post claims that none of them had even set foot in Australia when they founded the restaurant. There's also this really well articulated response on Quora about the Australia theme. This guy Richard says, Outback is an American steakhouse selling American food with a superficial Australian theme. There's literally nothing Australian about it apart from the kitschy decor and the names they've given to American dishes. One of the difficulties of having an Australian restaurant is that Australia doesn't have a well-defined cuisine. There are plenty of typically Australian foods, but they aren't so distinct from British and American foods that you'd immediately notice the difference if it wasn't pointed out. Literally no food on their menu would remind an Australian of home. I feel like that would blow the minds of like 75% of Americans. People also suspect that the founders were trying to capitalize on the Australia mania that swept the US in the 80s, which was maybe best exemplified by the popularity of the 1986 film Crocodile Dundee.
That's not a knife.
So all in all, it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't carry over that theme when they expanded to Australia. I wasn't prepared for that twist. The American locations I've been to label their bathrooms with blokes and Sheilas, and while this location did not have those labels, it did have this monstrosity of a urinal trough. After my realization about the theme, I took a closer look at the menu and realized that many of the Australian-themed items from the American menu were either missing or had different names. Like the Australian menu didn't have Gold Coast coconut shrimp, the Melbourne porterhouse, Aussie fries, those are just called chips in Australia, Tasmanian chili, Queensland chicken and shrimp. Yikes. I just want to publicly apologize for my pronunciation of Queensland throughout this video. I promise I looked it up ahead of time and tried to do it right, but I was misled by this video telling me how to pronounce it.
Queensland.
So to the good people of Queensland, I just want to say I'm sorry and I hope you accept this apology. Okay. Toowoomba salmon, Brisbane Caesar salad, or Aussie Palmer. The wings also were not called kookaburra wings, maybe to avoid any potential misunderstanding that they came from the actual kookaburra bird. I don't know. US locations of Outback are doing a promotion for a 3-course meal right now, and it's called Aussie Aussie Aussie. But as far as I could tell, no evidence of that promotion happening at Australian locations. Hilariously, that deal includes a New York-style cheesecake for dessert, which they did have on the Australian menu. That checks out. They still had a few references to Australian places, like the Red Centre Sauté or the Alice Springs chicken, but way less than on the American menu. Also, I want to take this opportunity to make a very important distinction. I know the term shrimp on the barbie gets thrown around a lot when Americans do an Australian accent.
Let's put another shrimp on the barbie.
Let's put another shrimp on the barbie.
Shrimp on the barbie.
I think most of that can be traced back to this Australian tourism ad from the 80s.
I'll slip an extra shrimp on the barbie for you.
But here's the thing, no one calls them shrimp in Australia. They're called prawns.
And typically in Australia, we don't really barbecue prawns. Most of the time people boil them. So the whole statement is just ridiculous for an Australian.
So even though they're a signature menu item at Outback, there's no shrimp on the barbie on the menu at Australian Outback locations. Okay, and now the moment you've all been waiting for. A review of the food served at an Australian-themed American restaurant located in Australia by an American.
So the bread, despite looking different from its American counterpart, still tasted fairly similar. Not quite as good, but not bad. The bloomin' onion came out first, and I know it's not an Australian dish, but I can honestly say it was the best bloomin' onion I've ever had. The one I had in Virginia the week before was burnt to a crisp, but this one was fried to perfection. Even the sauce was better than I remembered. The salad was fine, nothing to write home about, but next it was time to try the piece de resistance. 285 grams of steak that I had traveled over 9,000 miles for. I turned my hat around backwards and dug in. And you guys, it was delicious. I added a little garlic butter, which was phenomenal. Great color, great texture, great flavor. And from there I tried the mashed potatoes, which were okay, and then I made my way back through everything, just trying to soak it all in. I finished off my steak, and I'm not even sure what to say. I mean, it was just delightful. The milkshake arrived, and it was definitely just the chocolate thunder part, not the strawberry cheesecake, which was a relief, because I don't think I could have handled both at this point. It was tasty, but honestly I was just so full that I decided to tap out about halfway through. I wasn't sure if it was the jet lag or the half of a bloomin' onion sitting in my stomach, which by the way is technically supposed to serve 6 people, but I felt like I needed a nap. My server asked if I wanted to take my leftover bloomin' onion to go, and I considered it, but I don't think that my fellow airplane passengers would have appreciated smelling that for 14 plus hours. It got to the point in the meal where the check typically comes in an American restaurant, so I did a quick Google search to figure out how I should go about paying. TripAdvisor told me that it can vary. Like some restaurants, they bring it to your table, and others you go pay at the front. But at most, you can just politely ask your server for the bill, because they won't bring it out to you automatically. You have to ask for it. Also, it's the bill, not the check. I worked up some courage and tried to give that a shot, and they quickly let me know that you just pay at the front. Embarrassing. TripAdvisor let me down big time. I bet my server and I had both just been sitting there looking at the other for a while, being like, I wonder what he's waiting for. As I was paying, they were super nice, and they encouraged me to leave a Google review. So I was like, sure will. If you want, you can go find that Google review and upvote it. Just search for Brisbane and then Outback Steakhouse locations, and this one was the Aspley location. So having achieved what I came for, I left with a full stomach and a full heart.
All right, well, guess it's time to head back to the airport. I'm just kidding. I really did fly all the way here to eat at Outback Steakhouse, but my flight home doesn't leave for a few days, so I figured it could be fun to explore a little bit. I surveyed some Australian viewers and asked them for recommendations for can't miss experiences and foods that are actually Australian. And my goal was to taste and experience as many of those things as humanly possible before I flew back to the US. So even though my knowledge of Australia isn't actually 100% derived from Outback Steakhouse, this is where I think it probably comes from. 35% Steve Irwin, 25% Outback Steakhouse, 15% combined influence of Hugh Jackman, Nicole Kidman, and Keith Urban, 8% the song Down Under by Men at Work, 7% The Wiggles. I reached out to The Wiggles about collaborating on this video, but they did not respond. 5% Finding Nemo, 4% Survivor Season 2, and 1% actual historical knowledge. I hope that by the time I fly home, I'll have a much truer picture of Australia than this pie chart. For my first stop, I made my way down to the Gold Coast and found a hotel just a few blocks from the beach. Did I mention that I flew here without booking a single night of lodging? Not the most responsible thing I've ever done, but I was like, I'm sure it'll be fine. I will say this though, the customs people do not like it when you tell them you don't know where you'll be staying. The area I ended up staying in was called Surfer's Paradise. I swung by the grocery store to pick up a couple Australian goodies, but I was wiped out, so I decided to save them for the next day. I'm pretty sure I fell asleep the second my head hit the pillow. When I woke up the next morning, it kind of took me a second to remember that I had flown to Australia to eat at an Outback Steakhouse. Like, that sentence very well could have been a fever dream, but it was very much real, so I started my day by walking to the beach and dipping my feet in the Pacific. It was pretty disorienting to see so many signs about the Pacific when referring to the East Coast. I'm so used to Pacific meaning West. Also, it wasn't foggy. My cameras were just cold from the night before because I didn't really know a reasonable temperature to set the thermostat to since it was in Celsius. So the lenses fogged up a little bit when I went outside. It was beautiful out and the sand was so soft. I made my way back to my hotel room and I opened up my spoils from the night before. One of the most iconic Australian foods is Vegemite, which I'd heard of before but didn't fully know what to expect. I picked some up from the grocery store, but it's traditionally served on toast, so it would have to wait until I had access to a toaster. I moved on to a little something called Tim Tams. It's like a wafer type material covered in chocolate. At US locations, Outback actually has a dessert called the Tim Tam brownie cake, which ironically was not on the Australian Outback menu. I'd say they're good, but not like mind-blowing, so 7.5 out of 10. Apparently you can bite off both ends and use it as a straw, and that's called a Tim Tam Slam. I'm not sure how effective that would be, but 10 out of 10 for the name. Next up was a snack called Shapes. These are little cracker things, and the standard flavor flavor is barbecue. I was imagining the taste of like a Lay's barbecue chip, but it wasn't like that at all. The parsley and other spices on there were phenomenal. I don't want to over-exaggerate, but I think you could sneak these onto a charcuterie board in the US and no one would notice. 8 out of 10. A beverage that got recommended to me several times was Bundaberg ginger beer. The first thing that stuck out to me is that the ginger flavor was much more prominent than it is in something like American ginger ale, to the point where I was like, is ginger ale even named for the kitchen spice? Whereas with the Bundaberg, there was no question about it. There was definitely ginger in this bad boy. I wasn't sure I loved that, but still solid. I would drink it again. 7 out of 10. On the packaging for the food items, there was this health star rating system that was really interesting to me. Like, who gets to decide that? I could see how that could simplify the shopping process for consumers, but I could also see how maybe it removes a little bit of nuance when it comes to nutrition. Shapes had a 2 out of 5 health rating, and the Tim Tams had a 0.5 out of 5 health rating. Next up, it was time to try what I now know is a staple of Australian cuisine, the meat pie. So I made my way south to a little place called Pie Pie, which some have claimed serves the best pies in Australia. I felt like I was slowly starting to get the hang of the whole reverse driving thing. That is, until I had to parallel park and everything was backwards. It took me a few extra adjustments, but I think I nailed it. I walked over to Pie Pie and ordered the Baker's Original Pie, a sausage roll, which is another Australian staple, and a flat white. I knew that flat whites were popular in Australia, but I don't think I realized until I got there how seriously Australians take their coffee. The restaurant was just a couple blocks from the beach, so I made my way over there with my food. I tried the meat pie first, and I didn't have a ton of expectations going in, but I did have a lot of questions. Questions like, was I supposed to eat this like a sandwich, or with a fork and a knife? And was this even a breakfast item, or was I about to down dinner at 8:45 a.m.? The taste of the meat, when combined with the carrots and the other stuff in there, remind me of like a beef stew, which once again, I wouldn't necessarily like eat beef stew for breakfast, but it was still good. My initial response was to rate it 6.5 out of 10, but I would be interested in trying some other varieties. Like I saw some with other choices for fillings. Next up was the sausage roll, which felt much more like a breakfast item to me, and that was pretty solid. The pastry itself was both soft and flaky, so really nice, and the sausage was different from American breakfast sausage, but still good. I'd definitely eat that again. I'd go 8 out of 10. And you don't see me drinking the flat white because my camera was actually sitting on it. So here I am back in the car and 9.5 out of 10. Good job, Australia. After what I'll call my second breakfast, I made my way about 2 hours north from the Gold Coast region for my next stop. I just passed what looked like a warning sign with a silhouette of a koala on it. Is that something I need to be worried about and like looking out for as koalas crossing the highway? Sorry, the motorway. Oh, turn my windshield wipers on again. I was heading up to the Sunshine Coast region because I had tickets to Australia Zoo, which is the zoo that's owned and operated by the Irwin family. On my way there, I stopped at a Woolworths to grab some sunscreen because, you know, no ozone layer. I'm kind of joking, but I feel like the fact that everything was SPF 50 plus is kind of telling. As a side note, I kept walking to the wrong side of the car, just out of like muscle memory, and then having to walk around to get to the driver's side. Embarrassing. I got to the zoo, lathered up, and then started exploring.
We cut the legs off of our pants, threw our shoes into the ocean, sit back and wait through the daylight, sit back and wait through the daylight, slip and slide on subway grades, these shoes are poor man's ice skates, fall through like change in the daylight, fall through like change in the daylight, I miss ya both lines in my road, some solid on my metro, maybe I'll paint them in myself, maybe I'll paint them in myself, maybe I'll paint them in myself.
I didn't run into any of the Irwins, but I did get to see Bendy's trophy from Dancing with the Stars, as well as some of Steve's memorabilia like his boots and his famous khaki uniform. It was really cool to see the fruit of Steve's life's work and the places where he spent so much of his time. And even though Steve died almost 20 years ago, a lot of the animals are old enough that there are pictures of Steve holding them when he was alive. Later in the afternoon, some storms rolled in, so I swung by the animal hospital and then made my way back to my car. I threw back a few more shapes and washed them down with some ginger beer. This was totally unplanned, but the Jonas Brothers were actually in Australia at the same time I was, which is hilarious. The venue they were playing at was less than 5 miles from the Outback I went to. If I'd stayed one more night near Brisbane, I could have continued my quest to try to deliver waffles to them, but there was so much to see in so little time, so I pressed on. I made my way to the airport to catch a flight that night from Brisbane to Cairns, which is in far north Queensland. Mostly because of poor planning, but also because I bought the cheapest tickets possible, my luggage exceeded the weight allowance by a couple kilos. So I put on all my heaviest clothes and had to part ways with some non-essentials, including my jar of Vegemite. That felt a little bit disrespectful, but I knew I could buy some more once I landed. After a relatively short flight, I landed in Cairns, and man, if I thought it was humid in Brisbane, it felt twice as humid here. I kept forgetting that going north in Australia actually means moving closer to the equator. I picked up my rental car, found my Airbnb, and then fell asleep hard. The next morning, I went to a coffee shop recommended by my Airbnb hosts. I decided to give the meat pie another try, so I ordered a pepper pie and then also a long black in a takeaway cup. I used to work at a coffee shop, and this Australian woman would come in pretty frequently, and that was always her order. I made my way to this park right on the water to have breakfast and journal, and it was beautiful. There were mountains right next to the ocean, really tropical looking trees. Something that I've noticed, at least in Queensland, is that a lot of cars have these bull bars and snorkels. I looked it up, and apparently the bull bars are for kangaroos and other wildlife. And there are actually more kangaroos in Australia than there are deer in the United States. And they do not have a good road IQ. To the point where someone cautioned me against driving after dusk because apparently you can't get very far without hitting something. So call me crazy, but it feels like Outback wasn't too far off with that theming. Okay, I tried the pepper pie, and I liked this one much better than the meat pie the day before. No vegetables, and much less of like that stew taste. I'd go 8.5 out of 10. The long black was pretty straightforward, but it got the job done. Not quite as good as the flat white, but that's just my opinion, so 7 out of 10. After that, I swung by the grocery store to restock on Vegemite and to pick up some bug spray since I'd be spending the majority of this day in the rainforest. By day 3, I felt like I was a pro at driving on the left side of the road. And by that, I mean I didn't pee my pants every time I got behind the wheel of the car. This is wild, but the windshield wiper and blinker were switched back on this car. I had just started to get the hang of it, and they pulled a fast one on me. I guess it depends on the make of the car. I made my way to a nature park called Rainforest Station, which is about 30 minutes north of Cairns. I got to get up close with more koalas, more crocs, and a bunch of other animals. And then ride through the rainforest on a duck boat. So it was basically like Boston. I had lunch while I was there, and ironically, their buffet was called the Outback Restaurant. They had what they described as an Aussie barbecue, which included fresh fruit. I think this is a papaya. How do you even eat these? I don't know. Porterhouse steak, pork sausage, barbecue chicken, roasted potatoes, steamed vegetables, and rice. My review was that the sausage was good, the steak was okay, a little dry, dare I say, not something you'd serve at an Outback Steakhouse, but the chicken was phenomenal. Like, if this is what people mean when they say an Aussie barbecue, I'm a big fan. 9 out of 10. The reason I wanted to go to this nature park in particular was because of something called the Pomagiri Aboriginal Experience, which featured a traditional dance performance. Afterwards, we got to learn more about the didgeridoo. Turns out didgeridoo is not an indigenous word, and most people groups in Australia have their own word for it. There was also a spear throwing demonstration, and I also got to throw a boomerang. Not my strongest athletic performance. I'd been hesitant to pay extra to hold a koala, both at the zoo and this nature park, but as I was getting ready to leave, I was like, man, am I really gonna come all the way to Australia and not hold a koala? When I asked, they told me that I had missed the last koala appointment at Rainforest Station, but there was another place in Cairns where I could go to hold a koala. So I scooted down there and paid $33 to hold a koala for all of about 4 seconds. But during those 4 seconds, time slowed down. It felt a little something like this.
You're like a dream come true. Just wanna be with you. Girl, it's plain to see that you're the only one for me. And repeat steps 1 through 3.
And just like that, my time was up. And I got this really corny school picture out of it. The koala isn't even looking at the camera. Still worth it though, because the cost of that picture went towards conservation. I stopped by a dessert shop on my way home where I scored a pavlova, I think I'm saying that right, and I took it back to the Airbnb to try. Just want to give a quick shout out to the lizard on the wall of my Airbnb. Feel free to say hi to the lizard in the comments.
Oh, what up, lizard?
Hi, lizard.
Oh, good day, Lizzie.
Lizard, how you living?
So a pavlova is a meringue-based dessert. It's got kind of a crispy outer layer, but it's soft on the inside. It was really sweet. I imagine most of it is just like egg egg white and sugar. But because it was light and airy, I felt like I could just keep eating it. Wikipedia says that the Aussie variety typically has passion fruit and sometimes pineapples, but this one had kiwi, strawberry, and some grapes. I feel okay about it though, considering how hard it was to find. I think it's more of like a Christmas item. The Outback location I went to did have a pavlova dessert on the menu, which is not featured on the American menu. Maybe I'll have to try that the next time I come to Australia to go to Outback Steakhouse. Overall, I'd go 7 out of 10. That night, I got a notification for yet another comment telling me that Outback Steakhouse is not Australian. I love it. After dessert, I went to bed, but the next morning, it was finally time to try Vegemite. Like I said, I didn't really have any expectations coming in, but the smell kind of caught me off guard. Despite what it looks like, it's not like a jelly, and despite what the name implies, it's not really vegetable flavored. To help explain how to eat Vegemite, I'm gonna throw it over to the greatest showman himself, Hugh Jackman.
You've got to have it on toast first thing in the morning. If you're going to go to Australia, this is what you've got to do. You've got to get, like, the crappiest bread possible. All right, so just a nice thin layer of butter. It's got to melt in. See this?
Yeah.
Maximum.
What?
Maximum Vegemite. No more than that. It's not like Nutella. You can't scoop it on. It's just refined, just a little.
I personally think I nailed it on the amount that I spread on there.
This is basically, it looks black and it looks kind of a, it's just salt. That's all it is.
It truly is just like salt, kind of reminiscent of soy sauce as well. I don't know if that's the aminos in there or what, but the more I ate, the more I liked it. I'm gonna go 7 out of 10 on this one. My next item conveniently involves similar ingredients, and it's called fairy bread. From what I understand, this is popular at kids' parties. The idea here is that you take untoasted white bread, cover it in butter, and then add sprinkles that are called hundreds and thousands. I don't know if you've ever tried to spread cold butter on untoasted bread, but it's not easy. I got that diagonal slice action, and then I dug in. It was kind of a funny combination of flavors, but I could see why this would be a hit for little kids. The hundreds and thousands were a little bit hard to bite into. For fairy bread, I'll go 8 out of 10. I gotta hand it to Australia. Here are 2 of the most iconic food items, and both are incredibly affordable. There's actually a third item featuring white sandwich bread that I wasn't able to get to, and that's called a sausage in bread, also known as a sausage sizzle or a snag. Apparently it's just a grilled sausage on a slice of bread, but it's like a cultural phenomenon. So there's this hardware superstore called Bunnings, and community groups can run fundraisers there called sausage sizzles, where they'll cook and sell these sausage sandwiches. As best I can tell, the closest American equivalent would be like a Costco hot dog, but even that comparison falls short. Someone suggested that I get a Bunnings snag while I was in Australia, but unfortunately they only do the sausage sizzles on weekends, and so my flight home was going to be before that. I wanted to try one last item before I set out for the day, and that was a pastry called a Lamington. I found a bakery called Brumby's, bought a Lamington, and then brought it back to my car. So Lamington is sponge cake covered with coconut on the outside and what I think is chocolate filling on the inside. Personally, I really like coconut, so this was solid. I'm gonna go 9 out of 10 on this one. And from there, I hustled over to the Reef Fleet Terminal where I caught a boat heading for the Great Barrier Reef. This is something that I've only ever dreamed of doing, so the fact that a silly video about a steakhouse chain would allow me to do this is incredible. On the way out to the reef, we were served morning tea with danishes, cookies, or biscuits, and Bushell's tea. And between the rain, some rough waters, and a few engine issues, the ride out there was a little choppy. People were kind of dropping like flies, getting seasick. Fortunately, by the time we made it out to the reef site, conditions had calmed down and the sun was starting to come out. There were a few things that I was hoping I'd get to see while I was out there, but I didn't expect to get to check off every single box on my wish list.
I was moving towards new open doors, and I could feel the heart of the city spinning, making to wake up a feeling of past times. Just last night I was wondering if I'd ever love again. How could I be so wrong? And I remember staring up at the window, not caring that I was little and dreaming. Take me in, I could feel again, everything was real again. Through the gateway into the lights we
We had lunch while we were out on the boat featuring some local caught prawns, but I spent as much time as I could in the water. By the end of the day, my hands were a tiny bit wrinkly. And this was by far one of the coolest experiences of my life. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't know how someone could look at that level of beauty and intricacy and think this was all just like a random accident. It was just so cool. At the end of the day, we made our way back to shore, and I made my way to the airport because I needed to fly to Melbourne. I landed at like 12:10 a.m. local time, so I picked up my car, headed to another Airbnb, and got a few hours of sleep. This was my last full day in Australia, and I actually had another flight to catch not long after that, so I spent my one morning in Victoria driving to a destination that I'd seen pictures of but really wanted to see with my own eyes. And that's a rock formation off the coast called the 12 Apostles. To get to the 12 Apostles, I took the scenic route along something called the Great Ocean Road.
Go the woods, try and understand it. Make a
It was awesome getting to see the 12 Apostles in person. I just wish I could have stayed longer. I was cutting it a little close to get back to the airport in time for my next flight, so I had to hustle there and sadly didn't have time to explore Melbourne. As a fun little Easter egg, I put a Studio Revue sticker next to the big Melbourne sign at the airport. So if you're ever in Melbourne, send me a picture or a video of you with that sticker. This last leg of the journey would take me to Sydney, which is where I'd fly home from, and also where I had tickets to see my very first game of Australian rules football. One thing that I really wish I had more time to explore is a category of food known in Australia as bush tucker. That's what they call food derived from plants and animals native to Australia and historically eaten by indigenous peoples. Some examples include macadamia nuts, green ants, mud crabs, and kakadu plums. There were also things I'd never heard of like saltbush, quandong, wattle seed, and something called witchetty grubs. Traditionally, both kangaroo and crocodile meat are included as bush tucker ingredients. From what I understand, kangaroo is considered a pretty sustainable and environmentally friendly source of meat. But for the record, both Steve and Terry Irwin have advocated against the consumption of those animals. Once I landed in Sydney, I took public transit and I saw this guy just casually walking his surfboard through the train station. I made my way to the Sydney Cricket Ground to watch the season opener between the Sydney Swans and the Melbourne Demons. I was particularly excited about going to this game because one of the best players for the Sydney Swans is a guy named, are you ready for this? Sam Reid, spelled the same way.
Sam Reid. He nails it.
I don't know if this breaks the rules of the space-time continuum, but I was hoping to meet him and maybe get a picture together. I tried looking up a little bit about the AFL before the game, but I didn't get very far because, I mean, the caption on the Wikipedia page just felt like gibberish to me. Like, I don't know what any of those words mean. I got to the stadium right as the players were marching in, and people went nuts. I found my seat and realized during team introductions that Sam Reid wouldn't be dressed for the game because he was still recovering from an injury. They did, however, interview him on the Jumbotron, which was amazing. Each team also has, like, a theme song, but it's like an old-timey song. I think that's fairly common in soccer and other sports in Europe, but as an American, it kind of reminded me of that Peyton Manning SNL sketch where Will Forte is trying to pump the basketball team up. But I gotta give him credit. Turns out this is a really big deal. The championship at the end of the season is the second biggest club championship in the world. Like, it's bigger than the EFL championship at Wembley. There's even a video game series like Madden. The game started and I tried to piece together the rules just based on what was going on. But honestly, the more I saw, the more confused I got. I couldn't tell who was winning at first because each team's score had 3 numbers in it. Timeouts were also confusing because people went out onto the field, but play didn't really stop. Sometimes they played defense, other times they didn't. And look at this referee just being a silly little guy throwing the ball backwards. I hope this isn't offensive, but it honestly felt pretty similar to Quidditch, but without brooms and a snitch and beaters. Okay, it would be like if Quidditch had no brooms and just the quaffle. Eventually I caved and looked up the rules and stuff started to make a lot more sense. Turns out the 3 numbers on the scoreboard are goals, behinds, and total points. So that 3rd number is what really counts. During the 2nd period, I took a lap around the stadium to try to see what kind of concessions they offered. There was one last food I wanted to try before I flew home the next day, and that was the chicken parma, also called a parmi or occasionally the formal parmigiana. The first vendor didn't have any parma, but they did have meat pies and sausage rolls. I saw some guy eating a meat pie with sauce on top and I was like, wait, was I supposed to be putting sauce on those? I don't think so, but who knows? There was also like a full-on coffee operation at the stadium. I'm telling you guys, Australians love their coffee. I also saw Lamington for sale. I mean, I feel like this place was selling Australia's greatest hits. My search for the Parma was starting to lose momentum, so I made my way towards the field in the hopes of seeing Sam Reid. Sadly, no luck there either. Also, what is the ladies' pavilion? I really was enjoying the game, but I was zonked from how full the trip had been, so I decided to leave a little bit early and start making my way back to my hotel. I wandered around to a few bars and restaurants to try to see if I could get some Parma, but a lot of their kitchens were closing since it was around 10 p.m. Eventually, I found my way to a 24-hour restaurant. So if you ever find yourself in Sydney in the middle of the night in need of a chicken parmigiana, City Extra is the place to go. Parma is usually served with chips, aka fries, and a small salad. Apparently there's some debate as to whether the chips go on the side or underneath the chicken. Mine were on the side. I'd say this was a solid meal. It was similar to chicken parmigiana that I've had in the US. They just don't serve it with spaghetti. And the fries were okay. I'd say overall, 8 out of 10. After I finished eating, I went up and paid at the front because I am an experienced Australian diner, and then I headed for the hotel, exhausted from an incredibly full week. But I knew that I still had a few hours in the morning that I wanted to make the most of before my flight.
One day more, another day, another destiny, this never-ending road to Calvary.
Before I get to that final morning, I just want to say, Australia, I love you. Thanks for letting me experience your beautiful country for a few days. I know that like anywhere, it's not perfect, but I'm grateful to have gotten to experience your food and your culture, even if I was just scratching the surface. And I can safely say that Outback Steakhouse was one of the least Australian things I did while I was there. Yeah, so it turns out my airline canceled all of my tickets home without telling me, so I ended up spending most of my final morning on the phone with customer service trying to convince them to let me fly back to the US. But the good news is I made it back eventually, and believe it or not, I'll have more videos from Australia coming your way over the next couple weeks. If you haven't already, you can click subscribe so you don't miss out on those when they come out. Thank you so much for watching. Just remember that even when it doesn't feel like it, like, I don't know, maybe when you're stuck halfway across the planet with no tickets home, it's gonna be okay. I'll see you soon.